So during any adventure, your characters are going to be encountering combat. Mage, Vampire, Dungeons & Dragons, Pathfinder, they all have different rules, but there are some pretty universal tips that I've thought of over the years and some other people have thought of and that I wanted to put together into a nice list for storytellers that might be starting out to think about ways that you can approach encounters that work for a lot of different systems. So, let's get started. So understanding how to know where your players are as a group is really important to starting to think first before you start sketching out what you're going to fight and how. Because every player group has a little bit of a different composition. Chances are you've got a bunch of players that have created characters that are a pretty well-rounded group. You might have a tank, a damage doer, a rogue, some kind of mystical wizard that has the ability to do either a bunch of damage or give buffs, and that's a system that's built around Dungeons & Dragons or Pathfinder. But what if you're playing something like Mage the Ascension? All of those different systems have a bunch of different mechanics around the idea of combat and encounters. So if you don't have a lot of players that are built around the idea of taking a bunch of damage or doing a bunch of damage, and maybe you have just a bunch of squishy magic users, and you don't have a barbarian anywhere up in the mix, shame on you. What ends up happening is you have a very different combat encounter than you would if you had an entire combat setup with a very well-rounded party. If you send a bunch of high-level goblin mages against nothing but fighters, it's going to be a very different fight. Because what ends up happening is if you have an entirely physical-based party of nothing but rogues and fighters and maybe some barbarians, they're going to have a very different way of approaching the problem of how to beat such goblin summoners or goblin wizards than a well-rounded party that had maybe a barbarian, a fighter, a wizard, and a rogue. If you know what kind of combat your players are looking for, what kind of combat that they enjoy, that's something that you can consider putting together in your campaign. If you know that your players really enjoy taking on huge hordes of very tiny creatures that all die within one hit, that's a very different situation than actually having to stalk through a quiet library in the middle of the night trying to find the hidden assassin who strikes at people from the shadows and it turns into more of a slasher film. There's a bunch of different types of combat that your party and your players might enjoy a lot more than others. So know who your players are and know what they're looking for in the game. The next thing that's kind of important whenever you're trying to put something together, again, goes across all the different systems, is know where you are. That's your responsibility as a storyteller, to do a little bit of digging, do a little bit of thinking, do a little bit of research maybe, to figure out what world you're playing in and what goblins or kobolds or vampires or werewolves or hunters or whatever are going to be localized to the area that you're dealing with. If you as a storyteller are able to know where your players are going to be and have a little bit of a better understanding of the geographics of the world that they're going to be taking place in, it gives you an edge to be able to figure out what type of combats or encounters are going to be normal. And then if you ever have something that's going to be outside of the ordinary, like, oh, hey, we've been fighting kobolds and goblins this entire time, but here comes a water elemental. That's weird. Where did the water elemental come from? And then your party might start to dig a little deeper. Or they might not, and then you get to continue along with a plot that they totally missed that comes back and bites them in the butt later. Either way, if you know where your players are going to be and you get the option to actually put something together that makes sense in the area that they're going to be playing in, diegetically, it makes a lot more sense if you actually start to put that information together ahead of time and start to think about why these different creatures might be inhabiting this specific area as opposed to just having random creatures show up. Whenever you're talking about doing an encounter or setting something up that has stakes for your players, an important thing to know is what they stand to lose. And the reason that's important is because that can change on a system-to-system basis, or it can change on a party-to-party basis, or it can change on an encounter-to-encounter basis. Because if all your players have to lose is their life and their time, then the motivation to finish the combat is a little bit different than if, say, they have a group of villains that have kidnapped people from a local village and they're dangling them over the volcano. It's tropey, I know, but nevertheless, hear me out. If you have stakes that are happening if the party doesn't complete the combat and achieve a specific goal in the combat, it's a very different approach that your players are going to take as opposed to something like, oh, you get jumped on the middle of the road between two cities. If you have a very different idea of what you want your players to be going for other than total combat domination whenever you're setting up any kind of encounter, it gives you an idea of different types of stakes that your players might be aware of whenever they're in the middle of combat. Also, knowing what your players stand to lose doesn't just count on something like a physical level. You can also go a little bit deeper as a storyteller and try to understand what they might have to lose on maybe an emotional level. If you have a player who's created a character that has something that they can lose on an emotional level for their character, that ratchets the stakes up so much higher and it's so much more fun. This leads to a better point about knowing who your characters are that your players have. Because if you as a storyteller have a good idea of what these different characters have in the universe that you've created in terms of maybe familial connections or organizational connections or allies, it creates a very different opportunity for storytelling, because what you could end up with is a situation where you have a player who might be the strongest fighter in the world, but they might have a brother who is sickly all the time that they protect constantly and they want to make sure is safe. What happens if that brother gets abducted? What happens if that brother's in danger? What happens if that brother is being used against that particular character? It's a different way to understand where your characters are to try to figure out what type of obstacles and different types of encounters you can throw at them if you do a little bit of digging, a little bit of research, and a little bit of forethought before you start putting together these different things that you want your players to overcome in the middle of a session. This leads to another really interesting idea of what is victory in an encounter. Because oftentimes whenever we think about, as storytellers, what players consider to be victory, it's usually pretty simple in our minds. It's total combat domination. But what if that's not the only option? Because just like in real life, it's not really pretty common that total combat dominance is going to be the end of a conflict or the end of an encounter. What would it be like if the characters that had abducted your player's beloved NPC and kept them in chains in a dungeon, and then your player party decided to sneak into the dungeon, rescue the beloved NPC, and then get out of there without initiating any combat at all? It's still an encounter. It may not involve initiative in the traditional sense, but it still has an opportunity for tension and stakes and a very different experience than if you had just said, okay, the only way into this dungeon is to go past these guards, this gate, this trap, this bigger guard, this big boss, and then you can unlock the dungeon. That's still a fine way to spend time, and it's still a good way to have your players enjoy themselves. But if you as a storyteller have a way to engage players on a couple of different levels and provide a few different options, you're going to be seen as a storyteller that actually is prepared for the eventualities that your players might think up. Because what's more fun for a player? Having an option that the GM says, this is what you can do to save your NPC. Or if your players get together, come up with a creative solution, and then the storyteller just says, okay, you want to sneak into the dungeon. How are you going to do it? It's a very different scenario, and it's a very different measure of what is victory whenever you're talking about what your players want to achieve in a specific encounter. So, you've had the encounter, everything has gone swimmingly, you've rescued the beloved NPC, you might have knocked out a couple of bad guys in the process, and you've foiled the villain's plan. What comes next? Oftentimes, this is something that could get overlooked, and I've seen it happen. I've done it myself. I've overlooked it a bunch of times in the years that I've been running different games. What comes after the encounter? Because that can also lead to a lot of different other potential outcomes for your players and how you move the plot along. Think about the example that we gave before. You have the beloved NPC that belongs to a character, and your players decide that they want to sneak into the dungeon and rescue that NPC. Okay, great. They've rescued the NPC, everybody's out, everybody's back to safety. Now, say that you're playing the beloved character rescue in a modern setting. If you and your players are a group of lovable Shadowrunner misfits that have to break into something like a military base or a police station to rescue the beloved NPC who was wrongly accused of a crime they didn't commit, what happens if you injure a soldier or a police officer? What happens if your characters end up hurting some people or causing mayhem and destruction and maybe burning a building down? It's a very different outcome, because now instead of just rescuing a character quietly, you've created a whole lot of chaos in the world. So how your players figure out solutions to the encounters that you give them is really worth considering and remembering, because what ends up happening with the aftermath of what your players do has a massive outcome on how you can move the world forward. If it gets overlooked, it's fine, especially if your storyteller has a bunch of different things that they want the players to do. But if you can keep in mind how your players actually keep solving problems and keep finishing out encounters with either combat or no combat or negotiation, that gives them an opportunity to really feel like they matter in the world that you're creating, especially when they may not be used to having a storyteller that keeps track of the actions that their players actually do. And let me tell you, one of the best ways to create a rich world full of consequences for the players that you have at your table is figuring out exactly what happens after the dust settles and an encounter is finished. Whenever you're creating an encounter for your players, you need to keep things in mind other than just the mathematical challenge rating of the different creatures that they might be facing. And challenge rating applies for only a few systems. If you're playing other games that are outside of the typical D20 narrative, you probably don't have something like challenge rating to go off of. So that's why these ideas that we just talked about are a little bit easier to wrap your head around, because they don't just involve the math of, I have this many players at this many levels, that means I can throw this many different monsters at them. As a storyteller, thinking about all the things that come before, during, and after all of the different encounters that you might face with your players gives you an opportunity to develop your world, think about the consequences of the encounters after the fact, and really think about what should go into an encounter if you know what your players are looking for and what types of characters that they've created. So as always, thank you so much for watching. We really appreciate it. If you learned anything from this video or you had some good ideas that you think you might want to incorporate in your own games, let us know. Please hit that subscribe button. It helps me out a lot, and we really want to grow the channel. If you liked the video, go ahead and hit the like button. That also helps us out a bunch too. The other thing is that if you have any questions or ideas or something that you might have thought of as we've been going through these topics, leave them in the comments below. We really want to hear from you. But until next time, thanks so much for watching, and as always, have fun adventuring.